This series was originally planned actually as an in-person workshop series to serve our local community here in Central Appalachia, but due to the current and ongoing health crisis, as you are all very aware of, we transitioned to a virtual setting and actually in hopes of reaching even more people. We do feel like information on herbal medicine and sharing this information on medicinal plants and how to use them can promote health and wellness, and it's important to everyone, especially right now. And so some of Appalachian Sustainable Development's work, specifically in the agroforestry department, putting on this webinar series, is the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub. And this project that we have really shows our commitment to the community and to the special plants cared for in the Appalachian region. And so this is a shared use facility, and it enables local farmers to bring sustainably cultivated herbs to market. And so through sustainable growing, harvest training, cost share, and shared use processing equipment, we then collect and market their supply to larger buyers. And so we have a number of, trainings, cost share, processing, and marketing are a couple of the things that we offer here. And so your participation and potential donation, up to you, but all of this allows us to continue the work we do and offer further assistance to more farmers in Appalachia. So thank you for joining us today. This is Robin Suggs of Appalachian Sustainable Development. So go ahead, Robin.
Thank you, Sierra. And I am guessing everyone can hear me okay. As Sierra said, if you have any problems understanding me or Sarah on this webinar, please let us know in the chat. Also want to thank Sierra for her wonderful contribution to getting this technology up and running today. That is not my forte, so I'd like to give credit where credit's due. Today we're going to talk about two species, and let me give you a little background about myself before I get into that. I'm Procurement Manager for ASD, Agroforestry Program in the Herb Hub. My background is in horticulture, and I have run a forest botanicals business for the past 20 years, dealing with medicinal species in the southern and central Appalachians, basically getting plants into the medicinal herb trade. So, two plants I want to speak with you all this afternoon about are black cohosh and passionflower. Okay, I'm guessing that many of you may be familiar with black cohosh, also called Actaea racemosa. That is the Latin binomial. There are a couple of Actaeas that look a little bit like black cohosh. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But black cohosh, our candidate today for our propagation series, is an herbaceous perennial reaching at least 4 feet. Sometimes it can go a little higher. The blooms are present now in the central and southern Appalachians. Yesterday we came across some in the woods that were a good 6 feet. So it's pretty obvious right now. The leaves are large with pinnately compound divisions. I mentioned the tall white flowers. They can bloom as early as May and on into July, depending on your elevation and your latitude. But like I say, in eastern Tennessee yesterday, they were blooming, and it's mid to late June. The seeds will develop a little later in the season from these same flowers, these tall racemes. And, generally late summer, early fall, August through maybe the 1st of October, you'll have seed present. We'll talk about seed propagation in just a little bit. Black cohosh ranges through much of the eastern third of the country. It can grow up to around 4,000 feet. It's pretty site specific within that range. As you see on the range map, we go from the Gulf Coast all the way up into New England. It obviously doesn't grow in every site within that range. The further south you go, it becomes a little more elevation dependent. The further north you go, not so much. But it does like cool, moist slopes and rich areas. Predominantly a woodland plant. Sometimes you'll find it along moist branches, creeks, bluffs, those types of areas, especially in the Piedmont and coastal plains where it's maybe not so prevalent. And keep in mind with this map that just because your state is not listed in the map does not mean that this species does not occur. For instance, Vermont and New Hampshire, I can't imagine that it's absent there. These maps are determined by herbarium specimens collected. So if there's no collection from a particular state, it's not represented on this map, but I suspect that black cohosh does occur in Vermont and New Hampshire. Okay, so when we're looking at black cohosh, Actaea racemosa, what do we look for? I mentioned that there are some lookalike species out there in the woods, and identification is very important, whether you are collecting plants from the wild for germplasm, for planting stock, or for, whether it's rhizome divisions or seed. We'll talk about that in a little while. But you really need to know what you're looking for. Probably the best way, other than the compound leaves, as you see over here on the left, which, like I say, there's some lookalikes we'll discuss, are these tall white panicles or racemes of blooms that are present right now. If you look in the very middle, at the very middle slide, the upper slide, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. This is a close-up, but these racemes or plumes, spikes, if you will, we won't get too technical for today's purposes, but these are generally, anywhere from 6 to 10 inches in length. They're pretty obvious right now. They're borne on stalks, like I say, from probably 3 on up to maybe 6 feet, depending on how robust the population and the individuals are. Just below the bloom picture, you will see the seed capsules that will form after the bloom period. The seed capsules in that particular photo are not ripe. Those are unripe seed capsules, but they will turn kind of a dark brown and become very dry and crunchy when the seeds are ripe. And on the right, we have a rhizome that's very typical of black cohosh. And that's basically, I'm guessing, where the plant gets its common name. The rhizome and the roots are generally very dark chocolate brown or black. Okay, so the first species that we have that's often confused with black cohosh in the woods is called doll's eye, or Actaea pachypoda. As you see from the left photo, the compound leaves look very, very similar to black cohosh. There are some subtle differences. I won't focus on those because it's really tough to do in a slide presentation. But when we look at the photo in the middle, the flower, in slide or photo number B, or letter B, we'll see that the blooms look nothing like black cohosh. They're kind of rather than a long raceme or spike, they're rounded, and they also bloom much earlier. They're well past bloom stage now. They bloom early in the season, generally April and May, and now the blooms have faded and given way to fruit generally. So that's a giveaway with doll's eye is bloom time, the way the bloom looks. And if you look just below the bloom, you'll see the fruit that gives the doll's eye its name. It looks like a, almost like the eye of a porcelain doll. And if you'll remember back the slide from the slide before, these particular fruits look nothing like the green seed capsules of black cohosh. The roots structure over here on the right look a little bit like the structure of black cohosh, but they're typically a little lighter in color. But the blooms and the fruit are dead giveaways. So if you're going to be collecting from the wild, something like black cohosh, make sure you go in at the right time of year to identify what you're going to be collecting from. Maybe take some flagging tape or little survey flags, mark the individuals so that you'll know exactly which plants you identified during the appropriate time of year. Okay, another lookalike species is false goat's beard. And this is one that occurs probably more in the southern Appalachians, kind of rich cove areas. Many times it'll occur with black cohosh and doll's eye. The leaves look similar to black cohosh, probably not so much as doll's eye. They're a little broader, a little more toothed. The real difference is the blooms. As you can see over on the right, they have large plumes of really just, I don't know if you've ever grown a Astilbe, but it's a fairly common plant, but this being an Astilbe has very Astilbe-like plumes, very unlike the tall, thin racemes of black cohosh. The seed capsules, they look a little bit more like black cohosh seed than the doll's eye, but because of the structure of the inflorescence, they really are not structured the same. You're going to have much more branching. Where a lot of people confuse these two plants, black cohosh and false ghostbeard, is when they go to dig the roots in the fall, if they've not done a good job of marking or identification in the field during the appropriate time of year. When you dig the roots of or rhizomes of false ghostbeard, what you'll find is a rhizome that looks very, very much like black cohosh. One easy way to tell is when you break the rhizome open, generally the interior is kind of a light mahogany color as opposed to a very light apple green for black cohosh. So that's one way to tell, but again, the best way to really identify your species is to go when black cohosh is blooming, mark the correct individuals, and come back during the time that you want to collect your germplasm. And the next species we're going to talk about, Bugbane, Actaea podocarpa, is somewhat problematic because it does definitely look like black cohosh. It has a not so tall bloom spike as black cohosh. It has an inflorescence that's in the form of a raceme. The plant is generally not quite as robust as black cohosh, and it generally occurs at higher elevations and richer sites. Not always. Now, what do I mean by higher elevations and richer sites? Generally in the southern central Appalachians, this plant will occur above 2,500 feet or so in elevation. Not always, but that's kind of a rule of thumb in many areas. The main thing you want to look for in terms of identification and differentiation between Actaea podocarpa, Bugbane here, and black cohosh is the bloom time. This blooms much later in the season, many times as late as August and early September, depending on your latitude and elevation. But certainly it's not blooming now. It may just be sending up some of the bloom stalks at this point, but it's nowhere near blooming. So that's probably the easiest way to tell this plant from black cohosh. Also, if you were to dig this by mistake, the rhizome has a little bit more of I guess typically more of a yellowish color as opposed to the dark chocolate or black of the black cohosh rhizome. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about how to identify black cohosh and how to differentiate it from lookalikes, we're going to talk a little bit about root harvest and collection. And the reason this is important is we want to make sure that whenever we're collecting plants from the wild, that we do it sustainably. And as I mentioned here, really conservation in the wild means that collection from the wild is only done as a last resort if you can't find germplasm anyplace else. And you want to do it sustainably, which means only collect from populations that are healthy, robust, and are representative of many, many individuals. You would not, if you came across a patch of black cohosh in the wild and you only had 4 or 5 individuals, probably not a good candidate to collect from. If you've got hundreds or thousands of individuals and you've got healthy populations nearby, that generally can be done a little more sustainably. And you can also, if you're doing rhizome division, which we'll talk about in a moment, you can also replant a portion of the rhizome where you collected the plant from, and those will sprout back the following spring. You can also scatter seed when seed are present. And the nice thing about black cohosh is that the best time to dig it, if you were going to dig it, is after the seed are ripe. So you do have those seeds generally available. And since the blooms are pretty much requisite from an identification standpoint, you're only going to be digging plants that are big enough to bloom anyway. So make sure you scatter those seeds, if you dig from the wild. Probably a better option is if you can identify areas, and what we have is an area much like the one we're going to talk about. If you can identify areas, as in the photo below, that are going to be disturbed or destroyed, for example, logged, cleared for construction or agricultural purposes, highway building, right-of-way construction, pipeline construction, those types of things, certainly go in and get permission, of course, whether it's a private landowner or a public land management agency, get permission to do so ahead of time, but certainly utilize these areas where germplasm or rhizome and seed will say, when I mention germplasm, that's what I'm talking about, is planting stock, the actual genetic material that you're going to be using for your propagation purposes. But go into these areas that are slated for destruction and get plants from these areas, because they're going to be destroyed anyway, and you might as well go ahead and transplant them and get them growing in your woodland production areas. And it's a good way to conserve populations in the wild that would otherwise be lost. So you're going to be putting plant material to good use. Okay, as I mentioned, you want to look at mature specimens that are large enough to reproduce sexually. For example, ones that have blooms or have blossomed that season. And you're going to be doing that anyway in terms of identification. So when you've got a black cohosh individual or a couple of individuals like the ones pictured on the left, you can rest assured that those have probably been blooming and producing seed for a few years prior to that point. So when you come back after these flowers are gone and the seed have matured, and in probably mid to late fall through the early spring months, if you're going to take, if you're going to collect rhizomes for divisions, or certainly if you're going to collect seed, you need to wait until the seed are mature. But when you come back, after you've marked the individuals you're going to use for collection, you'll find individuals that do have viable seed, and so you can do your collection then. Or if you're not collecting seed, make sure you scatter those. Again, do not collect from isolated populations or populations with low density. You also want to consider things like we just mentioned, site stability. Again, is it an area that's going to be disturbed in the future? Is it, are you going to be potentially losing that germplasm to the bulldozer or something like that? Keep in mind too that, you won't be able to dig enough in a lifetime to what a bulldozer will take out in an afternoon. So go in there and rescue these plants and get them in the ground in your woodland production area, and you can certainly feel good about that. Again, if you're collecting rhizomes, wait until after the seed are mature if you can. If you're not given the option to collect at the proper time, and what I mean by that is generally, of course, with seed, you have to wait till they mature, but with the rhizomes, you need to wait till they're dormant ideally. But if the planned land use activity that's destructive will not allow for that, you got to do the best you can. So you may have to get in there at a less than ideal time during the growing season and collect what you can. And fortunately, with black cohosh, it's pretty resilient species in terms of transplanting in division. So you probably won't have too much trouble getting them to survive the transplanting. Okay, so we put together a video that will be available at some point after today's webinar. And this particular scene is taken from the video of me in the wild collecting a black cohosh rhizome. And this particular plant is being taken from a four-wheeler trail. This is an area that's frequented by local folks on four-wheelers. They kind of come through and, you know, we'll do a little damage to the area with the four-wheeler tires. So I'm doing a little collection here, salvaging this plant, getting out of harm's way, just digging the black cohosh rhizome. And what you'll see is I'll remove the top of the plant and remove also any extraneous roots that are growing up in the rhizome. As you can see, I just clipped the top of the plant. If you have any other roots that are growing in and around the rhizome, you know, if you've got some, well, I can't remember what I had in this particular case, but, you know, let's say we have some mayapple or some wild ginger or something that's growing in there. You want to take that out and maybe replant it where it's growing, or if you don't want to plant it back right where the four-wheeler trail is going to be, take that back to your woodland garden where this rhizome is going. This particular rhizome is not particularly big, but it's certainly big enough to divide. There are several buds or eyes, if you will, at the top. If anybody's ever grown potatoes, you'll know what eyes are. But in this case, we have some meristematic tissue there at the rhizome, and we'll make sure we have plenty of that visible, just like in this rhizome here. These arrows are pointing to the buds that we're looking for. Generally, when you're doing divisions, you want to make sure that you've got at least one, but preferably 2 or 3 buds present with every division. This particular rhizome, and this could be 2 rhizomes right here together, or, you know, little, maybe part of a bigger one. It's kind of hard to tell as the rhizome goes a little bit off the photo, but you could get quite a few divisions from this particular rhizome, at least a dozen, and I will demonstrate that in just a second back in the woodland garden. Okay, so here I am back at the home site and adjacent to my woodland garden, and I am going to demonstrate the division of these rhizomes, and we should have a video starting directly. If not, I will explain to you exactly what I'm doing. Okay, we may not have this video present.
I think that this video is deciding not to work. So you can go ahead and just describe to them what you're doing in this video, Robin.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sierra. Yeah, these little glitches happen on Zoom and with technology, so bear with us. What I'm doing here, this is actually a washing screen. You don't have to do this on a screen. It just happened to be a flat surface that I had available. But I'm taking that rhizome that Sierra was nice enough to flip back and show us a photo of, and I am breaking it and or cutting it into smaller pieces, each of those pieces having maybe 1 to 2, maybe 3 buds present. And I'm going to walk those over into the woodland garden and get those in the ground. If you can imagine, you know, much like the reverse of what I did when I dug them, I'm just going to open up a hole, and if you've got great soil, like I've got in my woodland garden, you can just open up a hole with a little hand mattock like what I use and get those rhizome pieces in the ground, cover them up, water them in. One big issue, or one, not really an issue, but one thing you want to kind of be aware of is that you make sure that when you plant these, you have the buds pointed up and the roots going down. I know that seems like common sense, but something a lot of people don't think of. But just pay attention to how a plant grows when you got it out of the ground, and if you plant it back, you want to make sure you get it back in the ground sort of, you know, pointed the same way that it was when it came out. Okay, so we talked a little bit about rhizome division, and as I said, you really want to do that ideally when the plants are dormant. But if you're facing a situation with a salvage where you don't have any choice in terms of exercising your preference, you have to do it when you can. With seed collection, we're a little bit locked into the time of year, because if the seed's not ripe, it's not going to germinate. And of course, some parts of the year, the seed's not going to be present. You wouldn't be able to collect it at any stage. So what we have here on the left is a good comparison of black cohosh seed that on the far left is unripe, and on the right-hand half of the left photo is a representation of what the dried capsules look like. And in the middle photo, we have a photo of the seeds that will come out of those capsules. So again, on the far left, we've got a spike of unripe seeds. You don't want to collect them at that point. You want to wait until they're kind of chocolate brown or very dark, almost black, before you collect them and they're dry. And then you want to extract the seed. Usually you can kind of shake the seed out of the capsules, or apply a little pressure between your thumb and forefinger to crush the capsules up, and the seed will fall right out. One good way that you can tell if the seed is ripe, you can shake those seed capsules and they'll rattle a little bit, and that gives black cohosh another one of its common names, rattleweed. But if you look at the far right, you'll see a detail of seed that are kind of magnified or blown up, if you will. That's what the individual seed look like. But you want to wait until those are ripe, fully dried, and the pods will yield the seed before you collect them. And we'll talk about seed germination and preparation here in just a little bit.
Alrighty, I'm not seeing that anyone has asked any questions, but please do remember that the Q&A button down at the bottom middle of your screen is how we can collect your questions. And I'm not seeing anything in the chat, so we are just gonna continue right along into our next plant, which is passionflower.
Okay, thank you, Sierra. One thing I'll say is, please feel free to ask any questions if I'm unclear on anything, or if you don't understand something I'm saying. Don't be shy about asking questions. That's what we're here for. So we're going to move on to passionflower. Passiflora incarnata or incarnata, depending on your personal preference. But passionflower is probably the only common name. Well, no, the maypop is another folk name for passionflower. I don't use it really often because I like the name passionflower. But if you hear people talking about maypop, that's also the same plant, Passiflora incarnata. This is contrasted with the species we just talked about, black cohosh. This is a sun-loving species. And so this is a plant you might find in the fields and margins of fields in southern Appalachia. We have a plant that is vining. The vines can sprawl for, really cover a large area. Blooms generally from June to September. This year it's a little late, at least at my place in North Carolina. We had a late spring, so in many places in southern Appalachia and central Appalachia, this one may not be coming into blossom yet. In fact, you may just be starting to get some growth for the first time this season. It has a very, I would say, a very unique flower. It's a very beautiful flower. I don't know of any other plant that has a flower, at least in our region, that looks quite like this. The only lookalike species that I know in terms of the leaves is giant ragweed. But the habit of the plant looks nothing like passionflower, so it's usually not confused with giant ragweed. But we do have this three-lobed leaf with both giant ragweed and passionflower. But if you see a sprawling vine with leaves like this, chances are you've got passionflower. And certainly once it blooms, there's no mistaking it. It has a fruit about the size of a small lemon or a small hen's egg, maybe. Pretty distinct. That is the edible part of the plant in terms of any culinary use. I don't think there's any problem ingesting much of this plant, but I know the fruit is entirely edible, or at least I should say the pulp around the seed is what's edible, or at least palatable in regards to the fruit. And again, we find passionflower in open areas, many times in grazed or fallow fields that have been cultivated in the past, or if it's maybe a pasture that's a little overgrown. Sometimes if it's a currently used pasture, I've seen these plants growing in pastures that have been presently grazed. So I don't know if livestock, I think cows in this particular instance, cows may avoid eating this plant. I'm not sure if that's always the case or why, but in this particular case, I found a huge pasture of passionflower growing in a cow pasture, and it was quite spectacular actually. But you many times find this in open areas, woodland edges, margins, roadsides, throughout this, I would say the southeastern third of the U.S. And it's not, you wouldn't find it at higher elevations in the Appalachians, but you would certainly find it in lower elevation Appalachians, the foothills, Piedmont, coastal plain areas, anywhere that you get nice warm summers and good sun. And again, this range map may or may not be indicative of its entire range, but it's pretty close. I would say the southeastern third of the U.S. Okay, another thing about passionflower that that also sets it apart from our previous species that we talked about today, black cohosh, is that generally where you find it, it's pretty common. In fact, it can actually be weedy in some areas. Think back to the situation I just mentioned with the cow pasture, where I found a really great population. It was sprawling all over this pasture. Again, if you want to collect seed or rhizomes from the wild with this one, the seed, totally, if you want to collect the fruits, that can be done very sustainably. If you're going to dig it up, you want to make sure that you're digging it up in an area where there are some other individuals present. Like I say, this plant, generally where it occurs, is fairly common, but it's not common everywhere in its range. So you just want to make sure that you do a good job of identifying good collection sites when the plant is in full growth in the warmer months of the year. If you have any problem finding sites like that, you might want to check with your local cooperative extension service or your soil and water conservation district in the county. Also, you may have some farms like the farm that I mentioned with the overgrown cow pasture, that maybe some farmers want to get rid of some passionflower, who knows. But in any case, before you do any collection, make sure you get permission from the landowner to do either seed or rhizome collection. And here we have, I think, another video. Yes, it is actually working, where I am showing you the passionflower plant just as it emerges from my field that's covered in fescue and white clover. And I think you can see my hand waving the stem around. It's still very small, probably only about 4 to 6 inches in height. But I'm trying to give you an idea of where this particular passionflower is before I dig it within this, my nice little weedy field here. And I'm back with my, my hand mattock, digging the passionflower rhizome. This particular one broke off a little shorter than I'd hoped it would. But you can see that we've got this root that's intact, and along the root, what we're going to see are some buds, some shoot buds. And once we identify those, we want to make sure that when we do any division here, that we include some of these buds in each division. This particular plant, like I say, is pretty hardy and fairly easy to grow. So, if you lose a few divisions, don't worry about it. And again, it can become quite weedy. So chances are once you get it established, you're going to have it for a long time, and it will spread and fill in on its own, both through vegetative means and by seed. But there I have a small division that I've taken, that I've cut off with my clippers. And I'm going to plant both of those back in the ground here directly. Again, it's a very simple process. If you don't feel comfortable with root divisions, then we'll cover seed germination here in just a second. Okay, the nice thing about root divisions is that they are generally quicker way to propagate passionflower. Some people also take cuttings. We won't cover cuttings this afternoon, we just don't have time. But once you take your root divisions, you want to plant them in the area that receive, several hours of direct sunlight. Like I say, this is a sun-loving plant, and it does sprawl. So put it in an area where you can give it some room to grow. And whether that's kind of a natural area where you can let it grow up shrubs and small trees and that sort of thing, like in a hedgerow, or you can provide some artificial structure as is shown in this photo here. We have passionflower growing on a small garden arbor, a particularly nice little specimen. It's both of our species this afternoon are not only medicinal, but they also have some ornamental merit, especially here with passionflower. It's a beautiful ornamental. And like I say, it also bears fruit, which is edible. It's probably not quite as palatable as some of the tropical passion flowers, but it is certainly edible, albeit a little sour. That's a beautiful garden specimen.
So we've got another question answer break, and I'm actually going to go back to a question that I think was just slightly late from our last section. Robin, what time of year do you collect the seeds for black cohosh? And then the second question is there a market for the seed? And before you answer that, I just want to let everyone know we'll take a moment on this as Robin answers. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and add it in now, and I'll ask when he's finished answering this one.
Okay. Thanks, Sierra. I think if I understood the question correctly, it was two questions or two parts of a question. Number one, what is the best time to collect the seed for black cohosh? And number two, is there a market for the seed? The best time to collect seed with black cohosh will be in the generally early fall. And I'm going to say that with a little tone of vagueness in my voice, because it really is going to depend on where you are in terms of your latitude and your elevation. But once the seed turns brown and dries, it's typically ready to harvest. And in Western North Carolina, that would normally be in like late August, September, sometimes as late as October. But the main thing is you're going to want to go in there and observe the individual that you're going to be collecting seed from, and just monitor it in terms of progress for seed ripening and the timing of seed collection. The seed is a little slow to fall out on its own, so once it does ripen, the seed doesn't all just fall on the ground and you've missed out. Sometimes those capsules will hold seed until the fall and spring, but I wouldn't wait that long to collect them. I would go ahead and collect them as soon as those capsules are dark brown and dry. In terms of market for seed, I would say certainly. The issue is always being able to connect your product with your customer and being able to reach your customer. So with any of these native species for either medicinal or ornamental use, I would say there is a market for any seed that you could collect if you could get them in the right hands in terms of your clientele. But certainly black cohosh is a species that there is a market for seed for.
Alrighty, and so we have two more questions. Okay. Are pollinators drawn to passionflower blossoms, and are those blooms edible?
Pollinators, I'm assuming, must be drawn. I'm trying to think of any specific examples that I've observed. I think in the past I've seen things like bumblebees, honeybees, those types of things, but I can't be sure. And I do not know whether the blooms are edible.
Alrighty. And then our last question is, before we move on, is Passiflora incarnata the only medicinal species of passion flower that is native to the United States?
That's a good question. I do not know. I think, well, there is at least one other species I know that's native to the Southeast. I can't remember the genus and species. I know the genus is Passiflora. I think it's Passiflora luteum, Passiflora lutea. I have no idea whether there's any tradition of medicinal use. I know the fruit is not nearly as large. I don't know of any tropical species of passion flower that are native to North America, but that, just because I'm not familiar with those doesn't mean there aren't any. But there are some tropical species that will grow in warmer parts of the Southeast and probably the West Coast. But Passiflora incarnata is the one that I have the most experience with. I wish I could be a little more helpful with that one.
So that means maybe a little bit more research for everyone in the future, but now that we've piqued your interest and you do have those handouts, please let me know if you're having issues with the handouts that I included in that reminder email, and they're also at the very top of the chat right now. But for now, we're going to move on into the seed propagation section.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sierra. Okay, I'm going to kind of breeze through this quickly, but I wanted to at first draw your attention to two types of seeds as they're generally offered to you by the fruiting bodies of the plants. On the left and right, you'll notice some fairly starkly contrasting photos. On the left, we have a collection of various seed. I don't know how many of those I can recognize. I don't know that any of them necessarily are black cohosh or passionflower. At least I hope not in the case of the latter, and you'll know why in a minute. But those seed that are indicated on the left are seed that are typically offered in a dry form by the plants. And what I mean by that is, if you can imagine corn or the seed that we talked about with the dried capsules of black cohosh, peas, things like false unicorn root, also they mature into a dried capsule. Anything that has a fruiting body that typically dries as it matures, those seed can generally be stored fairly well in a dried state, and I would say necessarily in a dry environment, low humidity environment. And typically they're a seed that can be stored a long time sealed up in places like a deep freezer. So, you know, a lot of garden seed fall in that category: corn, squash, cucumbers, tomato seed, even though tomato seed is probably a little bit of an exception to what I'm going to mention here in a minute. But many seed can be stored for a long time in the deep freeze until they're ready for planting. Conversely, a lot of seed that are offered in a damp or wet fleshy fruit like oranges and passionflower and apples, I believe, typically need to be planted pretty quickly. Bloodroot's another one, if y'all are familiar with that plant. They typically need to be planted pretty quickly, and you can't let the seed dry out. Ginseng's another one, by the way, that fits in this category. So, you know, knowing, you know, if you don't have access, the reason I'm telling you this, if you don't have access to specific instructions about the seed, you know, knowing the way the seed is offered to you will help you determine how quickly you need to get that planted. So in the case of today, we've got black cohosh seed that ripen in a dried capsule. Those can generally be stored in a low humidity environment or a cold, low humidity environment for a period of time. Passionflower, probably not so much. I wouldn't let those dry out. I would go ahead and get those planted or in a stratification chamber or outside ready for stratification. We'll talk about stratification in just a minute, but I would go ahead and get those planted pretty quickly. Okay, I just mentioned stratification. And that's basically a fancy word that us horticulturists use to explain a process of breaking dormancy in plants and seeds. And what do I mean by breaking dormancy? If you've got plant species that are native to temperate regions, in other words, regions that experience seasons, fall, winter, spring, summer, many species have seed that mature late in the season. And in order to keep those seed from germinating and being immediately exposed to cold and freezing conditions, those seed typically have to go through a period of cold before they'll germinate, which typically means they'll germinate the following spring after they're mature. So with stratification, what we're doing is either artificially or naturally mimicking those natural conditions. So many times what we'll do is collect our seed and put them in a suitable medium and a suitable environment for this stratification to occur, so that they are exposed to the proper temperatures that we need to break that seed dormancy. And here on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more specific about that. So what did we do to break this dormancy? What we have on the left are some pretty representative seed flats. There are a couple of ways that we can accomplish this stratification. If you have the benefit of an outdoor area that you have identified for your native plant nursery, you can plant seeds directly in the ground. You can plant seeds in flats and move them to outdoor areas. And typically with black cohosh and passionflower and most other plants, we're talking about getting those seeds in our flats or our outside planting area in the late summer or early fall. And they're going to overwinter there until they germinate the following spring. Some plants need a little more specific and a little more, I guess, complex in their stratification requirements. We won't talk about those right now. Ginseng's one. But for most seed, if they go through a winter outside in a cool, moist environment, that's enough to break the seed dormancy. What we do generally is take something like these seed flats. We'll take a nice soilless nursery mix and we'll put it in the flat. If we have some really fine seed or seed that we're worried about, we may have some problems with damping off or other fungal pathogens in terms of rot or decomposition. We may line out some, put a little layer of damp milled sphagnum moss on top of the soilless mix and plant directly into the sphagnum moss, or we could cover the seed with the damp sphagnum moss, and we can take those flats out to our nursery area and put them there for natural stratification. As the winter months progress, you'll have enough cold to accomplish that process. If you are planting seed directly in the ground, which you got to be a little careful. You need to prepare your soil so there's good soil to seed contact like you would in any garden. If you're stratifying in the woods or in an area outside of the garden, that can be a little problematic in terms of tree roots and that sort of thing. Raised bed might be a good solution for you there. But the main thing, it just needs to be an area where it can be exposed to the ambient winter temperatures. If you're a little uncertain that you can meet those requirements, or if you don't have a suitable outside area, you can accomplish the exact same thing by placing your seed in a damp medium, like maybe the damp milled sphagnum moss, or perhaps a nursery mix, putting them in a plastic bag in the refrigerator, usually 30 to 45 days at 40 to 45 degrees temperatures is enough to break dormancy. Also, if you happen to get a hold of seed in the spring, maybe you're buying black cohosh seed from someone and it's been in storage and it's not been through a stratification process, but you want to get those seed, maybe you want to get them started this season. That's something you can do in the spring, and by late spring or early summer, you'll be able to get your seed up. Okay, we could go on to the next slide.
Sorry about that, folks. Technical difficulties.
You're fine.
But we do have about 5 minutes left, Robin.
Okay. Yeah, we've pretty much covered the stratification process. The other thing I would caution you on, and let's go ahead to the next slides here since we're running a little short. I've got a nice little picture of some hardware cloth. One of the issues with outdoor beds is that many times you've got things like turkeys scratching around your nursery areas, or rodents that want to nibble on your seed in the winter. Make sure that you protect your nursery area with something like this hardware cloth. I've seen many variations on this, but you just want to make sure that it's something that, some rodent can't gnaw through. But, you will lose your seed in many instances if you don't take care to protect them.
Okay, everyone. So I know we kind of skipped through, but we can go back if everyone wants. But I do want to make a clarification. Someone brought up the picture of the passion flower leaf in our handout does look very different from the slide. I believe that the leaf that's included in the handout, unfortunately, another technical difficulty, so sorry about that, is a different species, but the Passiflora incarnata does have the tri-lobed palmate leaf. And so this one that's in your handout does have 5. Robin, I'm not sure if you know what species that is that we included in there, but that is our mistake. And so that is the incorrect leaf for Passiflora incarnata. It is a different type of passion flower leaf. So my apologies on that, everyone. But please go ahead and ask any other questions if you have them. Okay, is black cohosh monoecious or dioecious? And for everyone that doesn't know, that means is it able to self-pollinate, or are there male and female plants? So they need 2 of them, 1 of each to pollinate. And then the second question is, does every mature plant produce a flower stalk every season, Robin?
That's a good question. I think black cohosh plants have both male and female flower parts on the same plant. It would be news to me if it didn't. That doesn't always mean it can self-pollinate, however. So I'm not sure the answer to that. That'd be a good question. The answer to the second question, I believe the question is, do plants bloom every year? Is that right, Sierra?
Yes. Does it produce a flower stalk every season if it's a mature plant?
Mm-hmm. Generally, yes, unless something has happened to set that plant back. And what do I mean by that? You had some site disturbance, or something that's, I don't know the deer eat black cohosh. I don't really have any deer where I live, but generally, yes. Once they start blooming, they continue to bloom annually for as long as that plant's there.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any. And we are right about at the end of our presentation. So I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us for this morning's webinar session with Michelle going over alcohol tinctures. And thanks for tuning back in to join us with Robin today for propagation techniques. And just as a reminder, if you enjoy our work or you are interested in supporting ASD or the Herb Hub, you can go to the GoFundMe link down at the bottom of the page. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. Looking up AS Develop is our tagline. But in the meantime, please feel free to reach out to me at the email that was provided in your reminder email and your webinar confirmation email if you have any further questions. And please keep an eye out for a response survey to let us know how we did and how we can improve for next time, because as you may have noticed, this is our first time and it was going to be an in-person webinar, so there's definitely room for us to improve for next time. But we really appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you at the next webinar, which is going to be July 11th, and that is going to cover salves and oils, infused oils and salves, and harvest and processing of medicinal herbs. So we hope you signed up for that, but if not, we'll see you next time. So have a great day, have a great weekend, and we'll see you then.
Thank you, everyone.